Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest in this episode is Parmy Olson, a columnist for Bloomberg covering technology. Parmy has previously been a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and for Forbes. Her first book, We Are Anonymous, shed fascinating light on what the subtitle calls the Hacker World of LulzSec, Anonymous, and the Global Cyber Insurgency. But her most recent book illuminates a set of high-stakes relations with potentially even bigger consequences for human well-being. The title is Supremacy, AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World. The race is between two remarkable individuals, Sam Altman of OpenAI and Demis Hassabis of DeepMind, who are each profoundly committed to build AI that exceeds human capabilities in all aspects of reasoning. Parmy, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Parmy.
Parmy, the title of your book has the word supremacy. What kind of supremacy are we talking about here?
That's a great question. For me, the reason I chose that name for the title, which just kind of came to me very, very early on when I was planning the book, was this is really about a battle for control of technology. And control in a few different ways. There's the control around the creation of artificial intelligence and what could eventually become artificial general intelligence. There's the battle to disseminate that technology. And I think most important of all is the battle of governance over the technology. And that was the issue that was most important for me. I've joked that I could have just named it Governance, but that's such a boring title. I don't think anyone would actually buy the book. Supremacy, I think, kind of encapsulates this rivalry that was going on. It started off between the two men you mentioned, Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis, and then it became a battle waged between two or three of the biggest tech companies. When ChatGPT first came out, I was in awe of the technology, like so many other people. There's this incredible human-like chatbot that exceeds everything we had seen before from the likes of Siri and Alexa. And it occurred to me that there was a lot going on behind the scenes that people didn't know about. And I was aware of that because I had been doing a lot of reporting on DeepMind when I was at the Wall Street Journal. And I'd spent a long time investigating its efforts to break away from Google. So I knew there was this kind of battle over protecting AI as it became more powerful, and that even the creators of this technology were worried about it being entirely controlled by large corporations without any real oversight or governance.
So you have lots of behind-the-scenes information. Sometimes I was taken aback. I thought, well, how did you find that out? How did you manage to persuade these insiders or former insiders to speak so honestly? So what's your secret there?
Well, I've been a journalist for, coming up to 20 years now. And when I was at Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, I was doing quite a lot of investigative reporting. With that kind of journalism, it's one of those things, it's like high risk, high reward. You have a hunch or a tip, and you just have to dig your heels in and go in for the long haul. With DeepMind, trying to speak to people connected with that company was incredibly difficult because it's a very, very, very secretive company. I remember at one point I reached out to maybe 80 people through LinkedIn, through email. I would try and track down, if I could, sometimes even phone numbers, and just reach out to them. And in the end, I think only half a dozen spoke to me, and none of those people would go on the record. Everyone was very worried about speaking to a journalist. It took a lot of hand-holding, a lot of patience. This was many, many months of work. But eventually, I was able to talk to some of them. And it was often the ones who were concerned about the governance issue. That was why they were speaking. With OpenAI, it's a little bit easier. Silicon Valley is quite gossipy already. I was actually just speaking to the CEO of a tech company who was saying he wants to hire some developers in AI, but he wants to hire them in Silicon Valley, not in London, not in France, even if their talent is greater over here. Because if they're in Silicon Valley, they'll talk about what other companies are doing. They'll share intelligence about what Anthropic is up to or what OpenAI is up to. So there's this general culture in Silicon Valley of just being a little bit more gossipy. So it was not as challenging, let's say, to get people who were connected to OpenAI to tell the stories from that side of the pond.
So since you spoke mainly to people who were concerned about what was going on, is there a risk that you've got an unbalanced story? Maybe there's too much publicity to risks and issues.
Actually, sorry, I wouldn't say that I only spoke to people who were concerned. There were also people who weren't concerned. I've spoken to people at DeepMind who are current employees or former employees who are quite happy with the way things are going. And they think that the company is on track to not only build AGI, but build AI that's going to solve all sorts of problems like find new sources of energy and so forth. But you're right. With trying to report on a story, you have a framework in mind for the story you're trying to tell. And then you will ask people, did you hear about this particular event? Can you tell me more about it?
You mentioned that there was a bit of a battle between Google Research and DeepMind, and clearly DeepMind won because Google DeepMind is now a combination of those two organizations and it's being run by Demis Hassabis.
Yes.
Do you know why DeepMind won? And is it something to do with the different approaches that they're taking to AI? The cartoon version is Google Research was focusing on transformers, large language models, DeepMind focusing on reinforcement learning. Is it something to do with that?
I'm not sure exactly why Demis managed to get that position instead of someone like Jeff Dean, who is a highly respected engineer within Google and who was running a lot of the operations at Google Brain. But if you look at Demis as a strategist, he is a former chess champion. He's the kind of guy who looks 5 moves ahead. And this is what a lot of people who've worked with him say about him. They're not surprised that he managed to get that position because he's actually very good at managing up as well as managing down. Maybe he didn't get everything he wanted, as we can talk about later with his efforts to break away from Google, but he got perhaps the next best thing, which was much more power and a much greater remit, not just running DeepMind, but now running all of Google's AI operations. What an incredible position to be in. And there's even some executives or former executives I've spoken to who say that he could be the next CEO of Alphabet. And they say that with a straight face. He absolutely could, because AI is so central to Google as a business. So I don't know what happened behind the scenes in terms of the negotiations. It was really a toss-up between the two of them, Jeff Dean and Demis, who was going to run things, AI for the whole company, this more kind of integrated unit. One rumor is that Jeff Dean just wasn't as interested in doing that. He really is an engineer at heart and didn't want to sort of have to manage a transatlantic network of operations, which already had a history of a bit of antagonism between both sides.
I suppose that interpretation would be supported by the fact that he hasn't had a tantrum and left.
That's right.
He seems to be behaving like a good soldier and taking it with good humor.
I think that's a really good point, because if he had really felt passed over, then he would probably be off running his own company right now.
So we talked about the fact that DeepMind was trying to carve out an independent existence for a while. And your book looks at several different phases of that strategy. Although Demis might be a master strategist, at least that part didn't seem to work. Do you think it was ever on the cards that Google would let DeepMind do the kinds of things that they long talked about in their own internal retreats?
When you say their internal retreats, I'll just explain what that is. The way I found out about this was when I was doing that trudge through sourcing to try and speak to people. I managed to get hold of a former scientist at DeepMind. We had coffee. This was in 2020, right before the lockdown. He said that a few years earlier, the whole of DeepMind staff had been flown up on a chartered plane to Scotland. They'd rent out a whole hotel. It was a company retreat. And the founders of DeepMind, Mustafa Suleyman and Demis Hassabis, were in front of the staff and said, we've got some great news. We've got this new project. We're going to break away from Google. We're going to spin out. We're going to become an independent organization. It's a new kind of company. We're not going to be a company. We're going to be something a little bit almost like a nonprofit / NGO. And it's going to be called a Global Interest Corporation, GIC. This was this newfangled legal term to sort of categorize what type of organization they would be. And that they had this whole project, they just called it the GIC project. Everyone was sworn to secrecy. And everyone was really excited about this because I think there had been a little bit of discomfort among not everyone, but quite a few scientists and researchers at DeepMind that although they were there to build AI or build AGI, and the premise of DeepMind was to build AGI to make the world a better place, as cliche as that sounds, Demis often talked about, once we get to AGI, we can cure cancer. We can solve climate change. These things would roll off his tongue many times in interviews. And people in the company bought into that. There was even some executives said that we don't need to worry about raising money in the future because when we have AGI, the economy will be abolished. People really believed this. And they were also well paid, of course, because DeepMind was owned by Google at this point. So they felt like they had the best of both worlds. But there was always a little bit of discomfort that, yes, well, ultimately our paymaster is one of the world's largest advertising companies, which tracks the personal data of billions of people. And how ethical is that? So this idea of spinning out really appealed to people. It was a very popular move within the company. But what ultimately happened, of course, was that it didn't work out. They weren't able to spin out from Google. Sorry, I went quite far back in telling that story, but did you want me to go into why the founders thought that that was even plausible, that they could break away, as crazy as it sounds?
Well, the bigger question really is this clash between the idealism of doing things to make a better world and the commercial realities of we've got to keep raising money. In fact, we need to raise a heck of a lot of money. And that clash seems to apply both in DeepMind and in OpenAI, which, after all, was founded with great intentions. And similarly, they've gone through a different trajectory, which has led them to focus on commercial short-term issues. Is that inevitable?
It absolutely is.
Are the commercial pressures going to win every time?
Well, they have till now. And I think that's partly because developing AI is just so expensive. If it was a different type of technology, which was not so expensive, we might not have that same tension. But as we all know, trying to build particularly large language models, you need lots of data, you need lots of compute. It's really the compute power, which is the expensive part, and you need the talent as well, which is incredibly expensive too. And that is absolutely an issue that the founders of OpenAI and of DeepMind came up against again and again and again. Sam Altman, of course, started OpenAI with full intentions of just making it a nonprofit, with the tutelage of Elon Musk as his biggest donor. But then there was a little bit of a power struggle in the organization. Elon walked away with his money, and that left Sam and the team completely in the lurch. And no one was going to donate money for the sake of building AGI to save the world. They donate a little bit, but they wouldn't donate the billions of dollars they actually needed to build the most powerful AI in the world, which is essentially what they were trying to do. Hence why they had to compromise those original founding principles and become a company.
There's two big tensions at play here, aren't there? There's the tension between wanting to develop AI for good and the need to raise money, so the need to align with the values of commercial organizations to make lots of money. But there's another tension, which is racing towards superintelligence. Both Altman and Hassabis have acknowledged that superintelligence is an existential risk, but they either think that it's a very small risk, or they think it's going to happen anyway, and it's better that superintelligence is developed by them than bad actors like Putin. So there's these two big tensions at play in their world, and I'm fascinated to watch how they both wrestle with that. You seem to take a pretty sympathetic view to both of them, which actually I agree with. I think they are men of goodwill. I think they want good things to happen, but they're wrestling with these really difficult problems. And actually, for me, the wrestling over whether to race towards this existential risk is the bigger challenge, I would have thought. You've got to take seriously the idea that superintelligence will wipe us all out. And so taking us to that point without, frankly, asking the rest of the human race whether they mind is quite a presumptuous thing to do for people of goodwill.
Yeah, I know. It's like an incredible amount of mental gymnastics that these two guys are constantly doing. Like, yes, we're going to make the world a better place, but we're going to take billions of dollars from the world's most powerful companies. We're also going to make Superintelligent, which could also kill all of us. And somehow they find an equilibrium in their heads where all those things can exist in their brains at the same time and not drive them crazy. You have to hand it to them. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is. That's very good self-judo. Very impressive.
Yes, exactly. Obviously, and I've mentioned this a little bit in the book, and I think I've heard other people say this, that when Sam Altman talks about the existential risk of AI, some see that also as potentially a marketing exercise. It does also kind of create this aura of incredible power and possibility around the technology that he is building and trying to sell to other businesses. That's a big part of his business model now, selling access to enterprises to the OpenAI API. It's this weird counterintuitive marketing maneuver where you talk about the potential dangers of this technology because it's so powerful. That also unlocks this kind of excitement, I think, among some potential customers about what it can do for their bottom line.
I've heard that argument, and particularly people argue that he talks up the long-term existential risks in order to downplay the shorter-term risks to things like privacy and bias and transparency and so on. I don't find that compelling. It just seems like a terrible pitch to me to say, we're going to give you this very powerful tool. The only trouble is it might kill us all. That's not a pitch I think very many salespeople would want to take.
But if you look at his previous businesses, it's kind of in keeping with his modus operandi. He had this previous business called Looped when he was very young, when he was starting off as an entrepreneur. In my book, I talk about how he actually reached out to reporters, and one reporter in particular at the Wall Street Journal, and was really just talking up all the potential privacy problems with Looped, like how this could go wrong. And it was almost like maybe not exactly hedging his bets, but he seems to be quite comfortable leaning into controversy and leaning into the negative side of his company. I just see that as a tactic that he seems to use. And he appears to be using that again in OpenAI, whether it's for marketing or to protect himself a little bit from future criticism, to shield himself. It kind of almost discombobulates whoever is scrutinizing him by saying, well, I know that my company has all these potential problems.
So not everybody at OpenAI liked the style of Sam Altman and the way he spoke. Famously, in November last year, the board tried to fire him and did fire him.
Mm-hmm.
But they received a great deal of public criticism for how they went about it, and that firing soon was reversed. Are you on the side of the board? Do you have any sympathy for them?
I do have sympathy for them, and I think it's interesting. If you just take the whole story at face value, and you see that Sam Altman was literally saying in interviews months before the firing, this was at the Bloomberg Technology Conference, by the way, he was asked, should we trust you? He said, no, you shouldn't trust me. And he also said in that interview, we have this nonprofit board and they have the ability to fire me. And I think that is a good thing. So he had that whole structure in place. And what he had set up ended up happening. That possibility, which he himself explicitly talked about, ended up happening. Now, was the board completely intelligent and coherent in the way that they went through their due diligence and scrutinized Sam's behavior? I think at this point, I don't want to say outright yes. I have my suspicions they could have done a better job. But as far as we know from public reporting and people I've spoken to who are close to the board, right before his firing, there were deep concerns about Sam from Mira Murati, the CTO, and Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist at OpenAI. They had come to the board with concerns about Sam. This phrase that the board used when they fired him, that he wasn't consistently candid, it's just a nice way of saying that he was lying. He was not being truthful. He was being a little bit manipulative. And so it created this real sense of mistrust around this person who was essentially supposed to be the steward of AGI. And the people who were on the nonprofit board of OpenAI took that very seriously. They took their role as protecting AGI and providing proper governance for it very seriously. So that's why they fired him. From what I understand, they didn't expect there to be such a backlash. They didn't expect that he would claw back power so quickly. That really took them by surprise. And that to me says that the people on this board who planned on this were quite naive in how they went about it and should have gone about it in a much slower, perhaps more deliberate, more tactical and strategic way. And I think it was almost like they saw a nail and they just like banged it with a mallet, and they should have just done something a little bit more careful.
It's also interesting that most of them have since walked back their opposition to him. Some of them have left the company, but they've left on good terms and they're not saying bad things about him now. I've only had one conversation with Sam Altman, it's quite a long one, and my impression is very much that he is a man of goodwill. He takes very seriously the possible downsides of powerful AI, and unusually for someone in his position, he's perfectly happy to talk about it. Now, I think that could be quite discombobulating if you're part of an organization whose boss is saying, well, this is all really exciting and really wonderful. We might end up blowing up the world. We might end up making everybody unemployed and we don't have a plan for how to deal with that. But we're going to do it because it's exciting and it's got to happen. I can see how that would really shake the trees. I'm often surprised that Altman hasn't really pushed back hard against some of the narrative that's come out about him. Probably the message most people get is that he's manipulative and dishonest. And he doesn't seem to have pushed back by, for instance, saying, I didn't worm my way back into power at OpenAI. What happened was that the great majority of the people there said, if you go to Microsoft, we're all coming too. Now, maybe he was pulling strings behind the scenes, but it doesn't look like that. So he seems to kind of allow all the criticism about him to flow around without really taking it on head on, which does surprise me a bit.
Well, I think a big gorilla in the room here is money. When you talk about the people at OpenAI who signed that petition, more than 800 of them, to say that they wanted Sam Altman back, or else we're going to go to Microsoft, I can tell you right now, none of them wanted to work at Microsoft. And I have heard that from people at OpenAI. It was a huge bluff, which they knew that they were going to get. You were saying earlier about how the way I portrayed Sam and Demis in the book is quite sympathetic. It's absolutely true. I don't think it's helpful to paint people like this as villains, and I certainly don't see them as villains. What typically happens when things go wrong in history or any kind of situation involving a large organization or phenomenon, people have good intentions and then things get very, very messy because there are all sorts of other incentives at play. And that's sort of what we have here is we had two people with very good incentives, including Sam, and they were involved in a business that was just becoming much more attractive to technology companies, that was becoming central to their businesses. And they're essentially sucked into this. The force of gravity of these tech companies like Google and Microsoft is no joke. It's almost impossible now. And I'm talking about today, not just 2 or 3 years ago. Today, it's so difficult to be a startup, an AI startup, without somehow being drawn into that force of gravity of those companies. In the last year, 3 of the most promising AI startups, Inflection, Adept, and Character AI, which had raised hundreds of millions of dollars and were really seen as some of the next potential big companies, they all got acqui-hired by Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that with other AI startups. So dozens of AI startups are going to be swallowed up in similar ways. Not bought because the companies want to avoid antitrust scrutiny, but acqui-hired or some other way that they'll wind down and meld into the larger companies. What this is really a story about is 2 people with good intentions, very good intentions, but they just got sucked up in this system that made it almost impossible to bring those intentions to reality.
Well, David and I are about to put this to the test because we're involved in a startup which is focusing on conscious AI, the possibility that AIs could become conscious, whether we can detect that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really interesting business. It's called Conscium. It's a startup. It's run by a man who's been very successful, sold an AI consultancy to WPP for $100 million. So we've got a lot of talented people together, and really for it to achieve its goals, we're going to need to probably fall into the gravity well of one of the big tech firms. So we're going to put this to the test.
Is the goal to create an AI model that has some measure of sentience or consciousness?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It's more to find ways to detect that happening.
Oh, right.
The premise is that as AI gets more powerful, it may, as a side effect, or indeed as a result of somebody deliberately trying to do it, it may become conscious. And if it becomes conscious, then we're going to need to treat it very, very differently.
Yes. Yeah.
It's going to presumably have rights. It's going to have possibly the ability to suffer and so on. It might have very positive outcomes. I personally suspect that a conscious superintelligence would be better for us than a non-conscious superintelligence because it will understand us better.
Yeah.
But we think this is important because obviously consciousness is very different from intelligence. And at the moment, all the conversation is around intelligence, and nobody's really thought much about consciousness in the context of AI yet.
Well, consciousness was a big deal when the Google engineer Blake Lemoine believed that the version of Lambda that he was talking to, which is the Google large language model that actually preceded ChatGPT but didn't get released, he thought that was conscious. But I think that's really fascinating what you're working on, because that was just Blake Lemoine's own personal take on it. And what an incredible public stir it caused when he started talking about it with journalists.
Yeah, and rightly so, because it's a big issue, and it's right that it did cause a big stir.
Yes.
There's a very strong consensus that he was wrong and that there are no conscious AIs at the moment. But that may well change as they get more and more powerful. So it's important to work out what it would mean, what the implications are.
And I think what people are saying now, and I'm sure this is stuff you guys are tracking, but Demis Hassabis has said we're going to have AGI in the next 10 years. Dario Amodei has talked about it coming potentially even sooner than that. So yeah, it would make sense to have, what are the metrics to check when we're actually reaching that threshold of consciousness for these machines?
So on this race, the more that people say they think they might get there first within 10 years or within 5 years, it encourages other people to dig in and try to go fast as well. It seems that this force of gravity behind these big companies changes people's thinking. I point to the example of Mustafa Suleyman, who wrote what I thought was a very good book,
The Coming Wave.
The Coming Wave, saying here are all the dangers in corporations building big tech without sufficient control. But more recently, now he's at Microsoft, and apparently, if we believe the report, he's been berating OpenAI employees for being too slow to release new systems to them. Hurry up, you guys. We're falling behind in the race. How dare you? I don't know what's been said, but it seems that when you have to justify your existence in such a big corporation, some of your principles get squeezed out.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The trajectory that Mustafa has taken, he and Demis were really central to the effort at DeepMind to break away. Also, we talked about mental gymnastics earlier, and Mustafa, for a long time, held this real contradiction in his mind around whether technology should be completely controlled by companies. He was really pushing for a strong board of governors who had legal control of AGI. So he was setting up the board. When DeepMind was theoretically going to spin out, they were going to have a board of advisors who, or not just advisors, but sort of board of directors who would have legal control of the technology. And they were big, big names. There were people like Al Gore and former President Barack Obama, someone from the UN. Some of these people said yes, they were ready to be on this board. This was a real thing. But then, and I talked about this in the book, I think, that Mustafa's own thinking about this changed after he took on an executive role as vice president at Google. He would say something like, actually, now that I'm part of a public company, I appreciate that the real oversight that we have of the technology is there because we have shareholders and we have customers and we have executives. There's all these stakeholders who are providing the governance, and that is enough. And so he kind of let go of that real obsession that he had with putting in the kind of board that fired Sam Altman. That's what Mustafa and Demis wanted to create. So it was interesting to see that shift in belief there.
We've ventured into the territory of timelines towards superintelligence. It's interesting the journey that people have been on. Sam Altman has been saying for quite a while that superintelligence would be with us very soon. I think I spoke to him during COVID, and he said he thought it was possibly 5 years away, which makes it 2 or 3 years from now. Demis used to say by the end of the century. Now he seems to be saying possibly by the end of the decade, which is quite a big change.
Yes.
Did you find any of their timelines particularly compelling? Did you end up with an opinion of your own about when superintelligence might arrive?
No, to be honest, I just hear the timelines changing all the time. Former employees of DeepMind have told me that AGI was always 5 years away or 7 years away. And then you move the goalposts a little bit more as you get a little bit too close to that deadline and it doesn't actually seem plausible. You almost feel like, to what extent are people saying this as a kind of carrot to keep us all enthralled, whether it's us, the public, or the staff of these companies? So I don't know. I mean, I've heard Ray Kurzweil talk about this as well, and he's talked about the general consensus around when we'll have the singularity, and that it's come closer and closer to the present day, that it used to be like decades away, and now it's only a decade away. So I personally don't know. I do know, though, that the rate of development at AI, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is just insane. It's gone so fast. I remember even a couple of years ago when ChatGPT was just kind of hitting the scene, people in the AI field were saying, like scientists were saying, I barely got time to read the latest research paper, and some other big milestone is just, I can't even keep up with this. So it feels like we're in this kind of unprecedented moment where we might be heading towards an inflection point. But as a journalist, I have this knee-jerk, cynical reaction to, okay, we're going to hit this threshold in 5 years, because they've been saying 5 years for the last 15, 20 years.
There's another race that might be discussed, which is not just the race between Microsoft and Alphabet, but the race between the Western world and China. It seems that there are many companies in China that are setting their sights on advanced AI as well. Your book's already big, and it would have been maybe a disservice to try and shoehorn in reference to China as well. But have you been keeping an eye on that market? Is that a race that interests you?
I think you're absolutely right. That is such a big topic in and of itself. There are books about that topic, including a book by Kai-Fu Lee. But all I can say is, from what I've heard about what's going on in China, that there are real efforts into building AI, including AGI. Computer scientists in China see that as an objective. It's not just a Western world ideal. Companies like Baidu in particular seem to be moving quite quickly towards that. And there's a real kind of explosion of the market for large language models. And in fact, from what I've read, getting access to large language models in China, they're way cheaper for businesses to get access to, for whatever reason. I think in part because of the subsidies that the government there gives to tech companies and startups. But China does not seem to have the same kind of expertise that we have in Silicon Valley or in Europe around building large language models. So in terms of the benchmarks that these models that are coming from China reach, they're not really quite as high as what you can get from the leading players in the West.
One of the things that might happen as we get close to superintelligence is the intelligence and military communities will take over. I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine who thought he had a really breakthrough approach to AI said he thought he might be able to create superintelligence in the near future. And I said, well, if you do, what's quite likely to happen is people in large black suburban vans will turn up outside your house and bundle you in, and you'll be taken to a basement run by the FBI and you'll never be seen again. Then Leopold Aschenbrenner published his paper saying that as superintelligence draws close, the intelligence and defense communities will nationalize big tech in America. And actually, that sounds quite plausible. You can't imagine that the people seeing themselves as taking care of national security will just allow these amazingly powerful tools to be unleashed without exerting some sort of control. Is that something that you see coming down the track?
I don't. I can't see any of these operations being nationalized. The tech lobby in Washington, D.C. is so powerful. It's almost like more powerful than the government. The specter of big tech itself, it's so influential, it's so powerful. I cannot see that happening. I didn't realize that Aschenbrenner had said that. I'll have to go back and read that. I'm really surprised to hear that he said that these companies would be nationalized. One thing I have heard from someone at Anthropic, because I've asked them, what do you think is sort of a good counterbalance to just this incredible power that the tech companies have around AI? What can governments do? And they said, well, the government has funded NASA and governments have funded CERN. Why can't a government fund their own supercomputer? Build a large language model to rival Claude or GPT. Again, I know that governments have spent billions on those projects, but I just can't see that happening.
I don't think it's nationalization as such. It's more like a continuation of the Manhattan Project or Los Alamos. It's the government's really taking control, saying to the well-intentioned but naive software engineers and AI specialists, don't you realize you're leaking information right, left, and center? The stuff that you're developing is much more sensitive. We're going to have to bundle you up and prevent you from saying anything.
Yes. I could definitely see something a little bit more subtle going on, kind of akin to what we saw from the Snowden files with the collaboration between telecommunications and internet companies and the NSA. And of course, OpenAI has just put a former NSA official on their board. So that, I think, was very telling that there is some expectation of perhaps a collaborative relationship with the government and potentially even the intelligence services.
I think if governments, and particularly the US government, because that is where all the action is, really took the advent of superintelligence seriously, they might get very unsubtle about it very quickly. And they have the power to do it. Elon Musk likes to thumb his nose at authorities absolutely as far as he possibly can. And in a showdown, a full-on showdown with Brazil, not one of the world's biggest economies, he lost. He lost flat out. Elon Musk or OpenAI or Google DeepMind versus the US government wins. And if they take superintelligence seriously, I can't see them just saying, yeah, well, we'll just let this all pan out and see what happens and see if the Chinese get there before we do or not and see whether this turns out to be good or not. I think they will step in. I think they'll step in and exert control with a very heavy hand, very, very suddenly.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And it kind of makes sense for some sort of government official to be on the board of OpenAI just to see what's coming ahead and keep an eye on perhaps how close they're getting to this potential threshold.
Exactly. I'm staggered that they're not making that happen already. I'm really quite amazed. But I think it's because, like 99.9% of the population of the world, they're not taking it seriously yet.
Yeah, I think so.
They don't really think it's going to happen. And it's amazing because you've got the people who are making this stuff saying this is 2 or 3 years away. And the rest of us are going, yeah, okay, what's for tea?
Yeah, but that's because they've been saying that for a long time. It's hard to take that at face value and just trust it when other things that they said haven't quite come true. You know what I mean?
That's partly true, but most people looking at the space have not been saying that superintelligence is 2 or 3 years away. I mean, Sam Altman's been saying it for a while. As I said, Demis Hassabis said it maybe by the end of the century. Most AI researchers until quite recently were saying kind of 25 years or more. If you look at the forecasts run by that organization whose name I ought to remember because we had the lady who created it on our podcast.
Katja Grace and the organization AI Impacts.
Yeah. And Kurzweil, who I suppose is the ultimate prophet in all this, has been saying absolutely consistently for a very long time that 2029 is when we'll have a machine with all the capabilities of an adult human, and then the singularity will happen in 2045. And he's still saying that.
Mm-hmm.
All credit to the man for consistency. He's been saying this for 30 odd years.
Yes, yeah.
It's only quite recently that people in positions of great authority in these AGI labs have been saying that it's in the next few years. But most people are not paying real attention, and perhaps they won't until it arrives.
But I think they need some evidence, right? And you don't need a lot of it. ChatGPT was an incredible example of evidence. It sparked this gold rush and companies pouring billions and billions of dollars into this new technology because they could see it. And they not only could see it, they could use it themselves. So perhaps for people in government to start to take the possibility of superintelligence seriously, they just need to be able to experience a demo. They need to see it with their own eyes.
AlphaFold is a step in that direction, solving long-standing problems in science. It may well be that in the next few years, the large language models will solve other big problems. Already they are being challenged with intelligence tests of various sorts, and some of them they're still failing, but it may well be that in the next few years, even the hardest intelligence tests or tests of understanding will be passed. And I think that's going to make more people pay attention. But my final question to you, Parmy, is your book is a fascinating, often enthralling read. Gradually, it makes it clear that there is this force of gravity, that big tech is so powerful, and that could be very worrying for many readers. So do you have any positive messages or any grounds for hope for them to hold on to?
It should be worrying. I don't know if I talked about that enough in this conversation. Something occurred to me yesterday about that, which is, why does it matter if just a few companies control these models and how they're disseminated and how we experience them? And I think a great example is what's happened with Twitter and X. We have this quite influential social media platform. And so soon after Elon Musk took it over, we've seen this real change to just the way people experience Twitter, now X. It's much more likely to lead people towards radical ideologies. I have a colleague at work who was just following the riots, the anti-immigration riots in Britain on Twitter. And this is someone in their 60s. He said, after reading Twitter for a few days, I feel like I want to go and join the rioters. He was just looking it up. The danger of having such powerful technology concentrated in such a few hands is not just that those people have control and that removes our agency a little bit as humans, but there's also a big risk that some person with quite radical and perhaps even dangerous ideas steps in and takes over one of those companies. And I don't think we should rule that out as a possibility, because we've seen it happen. We have billionaires now. We have people with incredible levels of wealth that can just step in and buy companies. To answer your question about something a little bit more solution-oriented and positive, when I look at the future of AI, I am cautiously optimistic. And that's because I think we have history on our side, and I mean recent history. We've seen what happened with social media when we didn't properly regulate it, and I don't think people are happy about that. There's also a really interesting disconnect at the moment when you look at all the excitement on Wall Street and among tech companies about AI. Look also at what surveys are saying about the general public and how they feel about AI. And actually, the second trend is going down. The public is becoming more skeptical and more concerned about AI. And I think that's something that policymakers are going to listen to. That's not going to go unheeded. The regulations that we have coming from Europe, particularly the European Union's AI Act, which is going to really come into force in 2025, it's not perfect. It's probably too vague in a lot of ways. But I think it's really good that policymakers have that in place, that we have that framework in place that forces companies to do risk assessments on their AI models, on how high risk they are, if they're medium risk. And the regulations we even have coming from Europe to address social media harms, to address the size and market power and anti-competitive behavior of large tech companies. We have two big laws also coming from Europe right now. All those things are going to speed up the way that regulators deal with bad behavior from tech companies in a way they weren't able to over the last decade. So we're so used to saying, oh, regulation is so slow, tech moves so fast. And that's still true to an extent. But the speed of regulation, particularly with the anti-competitive behavior, the antitrust laws that are coming from Europe, it's going to allow regulators to move much more quickly. So we're learning from history. We're learning that when we get new conveniences from new technology, that there's a price we have to pay. And I hope that the public is aware of that with AI as we start to use it more and more in our lives, particularly for things like companionship. That's an area I'm really intrigued by. What are we giving up when we start plugging these systems in to our everyday work and our everyday life? Hopefully, people are going to be more aware of that, but we also have that greater oversight coming from regulators in Europe over the next couple of years. As I say, it's not perfect, but I think it's good. It's progress.
Final comment for me. I wish I was as optimistic as you that people are really waking up to what's happening. I suspect that we as a species are not. We've kind of sleepwalked through the arrival of transformer AIs, large language models. They were shocking to many of us originally. Now everybody takes them for granted, and a lot of people say, well, they don't really work. And I think the same is going to happen with self-driving cars, which are on the cusp of becoming ready for prime time. They're operating freely in San Francisco and Phoenix and Arizona. There's a big trucking initiative about to start. And I think people are just going to say, oh, yeah, there's a self-driving car, nothing new there. With regard to regulating private companies, Elon Musk does seem to be working hard to show all the possible downsides of a good person gone wrong and the damage that that can cause. But imagine if he was the government rather than a private company. Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin have shown us how hard it is to change media once the government has decided to take control. And once the government becomes a kleptocracy, there is no recourse. With Musk, as the Brazil episode showed, he's controllable by government. But when governments step in and they start running these organizations, if they do, which I think they will, there's no way back from them. We'd better hope that the people in charge are decent people.
Well, I suppose you could say to that, well, but at least with government, in the Western governments, you have a democracy in place.
Yeah.
You have democratic process. But obviously, there's a lot of concerns about how much that democratic process is currently being undermined. All the conspiracy theories and misinformation about election meddling going on in the US right now. We're 2 weeks out from when we have the US elections. There's a lot of questions about really the robustness of the democratic process now. But I take your point. I think that's a good point.
We really do live in interesting times. No question.
Yes.
Parmy, thank you very much for joining us. It was a fascinating conversation, and good luck with the book.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.